When you think of a museum, what comes to mind? I'm guessing that a lot of you imagine something like this. After my talk, I hope that when you think of a museum, you remember to include yourself in the picture as a visitor. Exhibitions are built for visitors. After all, that is the whole point. Museum professionals are constantly thinking about you, the visitor, and your experiences, and maybe you've helped them out with that. Perhaps you've completed a comment card at the front desk or participated in a survey. Or maybe, without knowing it, you have fallen into somebody's sample for an observational study. But don't worry, those are always anonymous. We don't collect identifying information when we do observational studies. We aren't stalkers. The reason that museum professionals are so eager to understand their visitors and their visit experiences is because by making connection with individuals and with the community, however you define that, museums become and stay relevant. So, who are these people that are constantly thinking about you and your visit experience? I find when I talk to people outside of the museum field that most folks are familiar with the idea of the curator, the content expert, basically the person that decides what goes in the cases or up on the walls. And sometimes people will also mention the guards or custodial staff. But in truth, museums benefit from a huge range of people and professions, including carpenters, educators, science writers, regular writers, grant writers, administrative staff, animal keepers. The list goes on. There's one part of developing exhibits and programs that most people are not familiar with, and that is called visitor studies and evaluation. That's what I do. Evaluators use tools like surveys and interviews to learn about visitors and their experiences in our museums in order to help make those experiences more effective. Exhibits are usually developed by experts in their fields, and so it's helpful to have somebody on board to act as an advocate for the visitor. In addition to addressing issues of creature comfort and usability, evaluators are helping ensure that exhibit content is accessible and understandable. As I said, it's content experts that are developing those exhibits, so it's nice to have somebody representing the public on that team. As a generalist, I really like playing that role, but I haven't always appreciated being a generalist. I grew up in a medical family full of specialists and always felt sort of second best. But then when I started doing evaluation studies, it dawned on me, sometimes my ignorance of the subject matter is actually helpful. It's my job to ask questions of those content experts on behalf of future visitors. This visitor-centered approach to museums has not always been the case. Museums began hundreds of years ago as cabinets of curiosity for wealthy world travelers and royalty. They grew to become and continue to serve as very important collectors and conservers of our cultural and biological heritage. But increasingly, they emphasize interpreting those collections for public benefit. The people that work in museums consider them to be informal learning centers. And more than just art museums, we include science centers, history museums, historic houses, botanical gardens, zoos, aquaria, visitor centers. All of these things are considered informal learning centers. They exist to help share and spread ideas worth spreading. And in this way, they are very similar to TEDx. TEDx and exhibitions begin with a big idea. They use a curatorial process to refine that big idea and to identify speakers, storylines, objects, media to help communicate the big idea. And they both sometimes get criticized for dumbing things down into sound bites. But sound bites or no, the reason they do these things is to excite and inspire their audiences, so that those ideas, those conversations and motivations carry on after the experience in the museum or in this conference. In the museum world, I get to work with visitors very early as an exhibition is being conceived, also while it's being developed, and at the end after it's up and running. Early in the process, the exhibit team needs to understand how do people relate to the proposed big idea? What questions do they have about it? What do they know about it? What do they think they know about it? This is all called their personal narrative. And learning about this personal narrative is called front-end evaluation. We very typically use interviews to find out what are people bringing to the table that relates to this big idea. Some of the most compelling, challenging, but very satisfying conversations I've had with visitors in a front-end study have actually been about firearms. As a generalist, I enjoy joining a new project team because I know I will learn about something I don't know much about, but sometimes that content is somehow challenging or difficult. I did not grow up with firearms. Nobody in my family was into guns, and as a city girl, I've always been really afraid of them. So last year, when the Cody Firearms Museum contacted me, I wasn't so sure that I wanted to be finessing conversations about firearms and then dunking my head in analyzing those data. But I was also really interested in the challenge. Could I put myself in that situation and be effective and professional and helpful? And then talking with the project team got me pretty excited about joining them. The Cody Firearms Museum is one of 5 museums housed at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming. They are gearing up to do a complete reinstallation of their core exhibition. That exhibit team consists of 6 very experienced museum professionals with varying opinions on firearms and what that new exhibition should become. It was that creative tension, along with the institution's really solid scholarly reputation, that made me eager to participate on that project. And it's personally very satisfying to play a role in helping create or enhance a space for thoughtful dialogue about this very important part of our American story. The exhibit team really wanted to hear from people at the center who were not firearms aficionados, people who might opt to visit other museums and not visit CFM, the Cody Firearms Museum. So we used open-ended interviews to talk to people at the center and find out what would motivate them, what would make them interested in this new exhibition. Almost every single person we spoke with told us that it wasn't the objects. Remember, these were not aficionados. What they were interested in is stories of the people behind the objects. Like this woman, who started off by telling me, I don't like guns, they're bad and scary, even though I was a nurse in the military, I know they can be important. However, this woman grew up hearing stories about the gun her grandmother carried in her pocket. And our conversation did not end there. She very quickly scaled up to larger issues of safety and guns and women in society, and ended up getting pretty excited about the idea of including a women's section in the new exhibition. It's not hard to imagine the kind of conversation that she and her family might have upon seeing that exhibit. I think, again, that conversation would quickly scale out of the cases and into big societal issues, and possibly even carry on over lunch. Once the exhibit team is satisfied with the big idea, they will start to identify objects, storylines, experiences to include in the exhibition to help communicate that big idea. And they will very quickly start developing exhibit components. At this point, the evaluator can help answer the question, well, how are they doing? Do people get it? Do they know how to use this interactive? And this is called formative evaluation. We typically think of formative evaluation as building prototypes or mock-ups of individual exhibit elements, or sometimes an entire exhibition if you've got the budget, and then talking with people about their experience of using those pieces. In 2010, the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, JANM, embarked on a 2-year project to develop and test a whole bunch of different interactive exhibit pieces to get rolled into their core exhibition. Now, JANM has another very important and pretty difficult American story to tell, and that is the story of the internment of Japanese American citizens during World War II. JANM exists to maintain a lively dialogue in our culture about that history and about civil rights. The exhibit elements that they were developing and testing were intended to help people wrestle with several key themes underpinning the idea of civil rights. Themes of identity, community, democracy. All of the pieces they tested were pretty engaging and successful, but one that really stood out was called Ways to Tell That You're Japanese American. And this installation took up the whole wall, and it had 80 little snippets that were mostly pretty lighthearted, like you always have a lot of tofu containers and know how to use them for creative ways of storing things. And so we watched visitors use this exhibit, call over their friends, read out loud. They were yucking it up. They were having a great time. So the staff also gave Japanese American people a way to add to the exhibit by writing their own ideas about these things on cards and adding them to the wall. And they made this available for non-Japanese American people as well. So by watching people enjoy the exhibit and by seeing what they wrote in the cards, we knew that staff was on the right track. They were definitely engendering the kinds of conversations they hoped people would have by presenting these exhibits. But then staff got really curious to see, but what are people taking away with them? Because we had been building and testing several at a time in a gallery space at once. So we created an exit survey to ask them. And what they told us was they were more than just recognizing what was being presented to them. They were really internalizing it and wrestling with it. And I particularly like this quote from this young person who said that he discovered he had a voice that matters. Now, this is a young person with a voice that matters who's out in the community talking about civil rights. This is how and why museums are relevant when they connect to people. After an exhibit is up and running, it's time to ask, did it succeed? What are people taking away with them? This is called summative evaluation. Observational studies tell us a lot about how an exhibition is being used, what's being attended, how long are people staying, what are they doing, and this is all important data because time on task is a part of learning. But to find out what they're learning and what they're going to be talking about later, we need to ask them. So at Exit, we very often do surveys, as we did at JANM. We'll often do interviews. Once in a while, we'll do a follow-up phone call after the fact. When visitors tell us that they've made a personal connection to the content, this is a win. And when they tell us that they've taken the ideas from that exhibit and tried to apply them in the world outside the museum, this is another hallmark of success. One exhibit that's been very effective at helping people scale up and make those connections is in the very tiny Pratt Museum in the tiny town of Homer, Alaska, which sits on the Ketchimak Bay. It's about a 5-hour drive south of Anchorage. It's quite literally at the end of the road. You don't get there by accident. It is home to Native Alaskan tradition bearers, Russian Old Believers, homesteaders and their descendants. There's a lot of scientific research there. There's a whole bunch of scientists living there, a lot of artists. There are 1970s hippie homesteaders and their barefoot children there. And happily enough, some very good restaurateurs. For years, staff at the Pratt Museum had been receiving visitors and answering their questions. And it was the same questions over and over again. Who are you? How did you get here? Why? How do you live here? How do you survive? What about these crazy winters? So by the time staff was ready, or the Pratt staff was ready to renovate their core exhibition, they had a good grip on their visitors' personal narrative. And that is where the exhibition is rooted. I think that's why the exhibit has been tremendously successful. One of the amazing findings is that people spend more time per square minute in that little exhibition than had ever been measured in the US before. There's a famous evaluator in the US who says that when reading the data that comes in on surveys or interview transcripts, if she gets goosebumps, she knows they're on the right track. Well, I agree, and sometimes those data get me a little teary as well. Some of the most beautiful visitor comments I've ever seen came from the summative data of that exhibition about life and living in the Ketchikan Bay area. And I'm particularly fond of this quote from someone who, for the first time, recognized and appreciated the value of every individual in a community. Understanding ourselves as individuals, as members of a community, and as global citizens helps us be positive actors, and that makes our world better. Museums continue to be important collectors and conservers of our heritage, but they're using visitor studies and evaluation and other means of becoming community partners. Museums want and need to be places where we can come together and wrestle with those big ideas, places where we can get inspiration and excitement and carry those things back into our lives. The value of the exhibition is not in the cases or on the walls. It's in the experiences that you take with you when you go. So at the beginning of my talk, I said that I hope you will remember to include yourself in the picture when you think of museums. And I do hope that's true, but I really want something more from you. I want you to join this process, become a part of this conversation. This afternoon on your way home, stop by a museum, or visit a museum online when you get home. Or next time you're traveling, stop in and see the local museum. Look and see what they're saying. Consider how that resonates with you and let them know. And for heaven's sake, when you're at the museum, if somebody approaches you with a clipboard or a tablet and asks you please to do their survey, please say yes. I know we will all be better for it. Thank you.